I'm Sarah Kelsey, and I'm a member of the Irvington Historical Society Board and co-head of its program committee. Rosemary Gatzik and I are happy to welcome you here as co-sponsors of this wonderful program today. How the Colony of New York Prefigured the United States, the future United States, presented by Pat Bonomi. It's fitting that we're meeting here in the library in Irvington, not only because it's the co-sponsor of this program, but because under Rosemarie's direction and very able leadership, the library has been the silent, too often unacknowledged partner in so many of the Historical Society's programs and exhibits. Some examples that come to mind: the library spent many hours assisting the Girl Scouts in their research for their recent program about Isabel K. Benjamin. And it consistently has provided us with research assistance, photographs, documents, and maps that we've included in many of our programs and our exhibits. In short, the library is the wind beneath our wings. Go, Rosemary. Now to introduce our speaker. Patricia Bonomi is first of all, she is an Irvington person, but she is a world-class academic. So we are very, very privileged to have you here. She is a professor emerita at New York University, where she taught American history for 27 years, specializing in the colonial and early national periods. She received her PhD from Columbia University in 1970. She is a Guggenheim Fellow and a Fellow of the Columbia Seminar on Early American History. Since Patricia's retirement as co-head of Irvington's Historical Society's program committee, she has been the secret behind the ability of the society to attract world-class authors and academicians to speak to us here in Irvington and on our Zoom programs. She thanks the library, to which she says she's indebted, for borrowing hundreds of books over her 60 years living in this community. She's published books on colonial New York politics and society, on religion and politics in early America, and on a once notorious royal governor of the New York colony. She brought a few paperback issues of each today, which she has decided she will allow us to take with us on our way out. And I thank you very much. Patricia, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for coming today on a lovely May afternoon. I'm just very pleased that you're here. Also, thank you to the library, which I've used, as you heard, for many, many years, and I'm so grateful that we have such a wonderful library, and also that we have such a wonderful historical society, which I've also been involved with for about the same length of time. The title of my comments today is The Colony of New York, How the Colony of New York Prefigured the Future United States, as Sarah said. And I just want to sort of set forth a definition of what we mean when we're talking about colonial New York or the colonial period. As you probably know, the colonial period starts with the first colony that was established, chartered and established, which was Virginia in 1607. So that's the beginning of the colonial period. And the other 12 colonies followed fairly shortly thereafter. And it goes up until, but not including, the American Revolution, up to the beginning of the American Revolution. And as you know, we're about to celebrate the American Revolution's 250th birthday in 2026. And the person who's in charge of that, as you may know, is Connie Kehoe, who is sitting here. And she started 7 years ago. 7, or was it? It will be 7 by the time we get to the revolution, but or maybe even 8 or more than that ago. And she's not only in charge of the Westchester celebration or commemoration, we like to say, of the American Revolution, but she's also on the state board, and I've been urging her to run for political office after all of this. We'll see if she does what I ask. In any case, the colonial period is the period that we're looking at today, and my argument is that what we see, the dynamic, the development of life in colonial New York especially, really forecasts what the nation will be. And yet, if you look in the typical textbook of American history generally, they always start with New England, or maybe Virginia, which was the first colony, and they go on and on at length. And then I just looked at a book recently, and it wasn't till page 45 that New York was even mentioned, and I don't think that's the way to go, so I'm trying to change that. So we are going to look at a map in order to see the 3 different parts of these colonies. Fortunately, I like this map because each of the 3 groups is in a different color. New England, you see Maine. Maine is included here with New England, but in fact, Maine doesn't become a state till 1820, but it's claimed as part of Massachusetts. That's why it's as part of that colony, and that's why you see it in this map. And then we have the middle colonies, which includes New York. And New York and New Jersey were the same colony through the 17th century. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, we don't have a mic, but if I drop my voice and forget to shout, despite my allergies, just raise your hand and let me know. I want you to be able to hear me. The middle colonies are the ones in green. New Jersey was part of New York until the 18th century, and then it became a sort of separate colony, but I think of the 2 of those colonies together. They were similar in their character. Pennsylvania, and then Delaware at the very end of the colonial period hardly counts. It broke off from Pennsylvania like in 1773 or something. And then the South in orange is, of course, we'll talk about just which colonies are with each group as we go through them. So these are our competition for the middle colonies for New York, especially because the textbooks and often history books generally tend to emphasize New England and the South. So I want to think about this a little bit. Well, first of all, one preliminary statement. This map is only possible when you have settlers from Europe who have come over and settled these colonies. But we all know that prior to their arrival, which they often called the New World, was not a new world to the indigenous tribes that had been here for 20,000 years. We've only just recently added 5,000 years to that number through DNA examination. Used to be 15,000, now we know it was 20,000 years ago when those tribes came over the Bering Strait and settled through all of the Americas. So I want to acknowledge that and also mention that you can't talk about New York history unless you also talk about the native peoples, because they were a major part of colonial New York history especially. So we will go back to that subject. But if there are any other questions that come up about any of this, we'll have a Q&A, question and answer period at the end, and you'll have an opportunity to ask those questions. So it's only once you actually were able, these folks were actually able to push back some of the indigenous tribes, but not all of them. They were always present. Many more Indians than we used to realize stayed in the eastern parts of the country, and at least until after the American Revolution. So we will be talking about them. But only, I will admit that mainly what I'm talking about today is the European settlers who came and what their experience was during the colonial period. So we have 3 regions. And I'm going to ask that you help me out in doing a little brainstorming. First, let's look at New England like they do in the books all too often. And if you just hear the phrase colonial New England, what ideas pop into your head? What vision do you have? Who settled in that area? And that area includes Massachusetts. New Hampshire was one of the original 13 colonies. Connecticut, the outflow from Massachusetts went to Connecticut. And then Rhode Island, but just dismiss Rhode Island from your minds because it was different from anything else in New England. In fact, it was where the people who were ousted from Massachusetts in particular went for refuge. And in New England, they called Rhode Island the latrina of New England. That was what the people in Massachusetts said, because they got people like Anne Hutchinson, Roger Williams. I hope some of these names, and I'm sure they are familiar to some of you. Okay, so New England, what ideas pop into your head? Puritans. I can't. Puritans, exactly. Okay. That was the group that first came in the Mayflower, and then about 10 years later, large migration from England to Massachusetts in particular. And what were the Puritans about? Why are they called Puritans? Religion, right. That's true. It had everything to do with their religion. And they were purifying something, which is what they got their name from. That's how the name Puritan arrived. Let's go back a little bit, a couple centuries to the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. Henry VIII broke from Rome, right, and he established the Church of England, a Protestant church. And these people felt he hadn't gone far enough, or Elizabeth, his daughter, who really was the longer person in forming the Church of England, more important person, in creating its particular character. It still retained too many Catholic or Popish characteristics for the Puritans. They wanted it to be totally bereft of all Catholic, any kind of characteristics of Catholicism. So they broke from the Church of England and they decided to come over to the colonies in order to be able to practice their religion the way they wished. Okay, so good. Now, what about the church in New England? It was an established church. That is, you paid taxes to your church. It was a state church, just like everything in Europe was. They all had only state churches, established churches. And that was what happened, that they did bring over with themselves from England. Established, and later it's called the Congregational Church, which is still with us today. So it's not established today, obviously, but it was in those days as the Puritan, or by the 18th century, the Congregational Church. The economy of New England was, what would you say? Because the economic factors have to be brought into. Pardon me?
Agrarian.
A lot of, well, they had pretty rocky soil there. Certainly they did grow crops, and everybody had their own little farm or their garden plot in the backyard if they lived in a town. What else would you think? Yes, Joan?
The sea.
Pardon me?
The sea. The sea. Water. The ocean.
Oh, yeah, Boston had a good harbor. Certainly trade, commerce was part of it. They had big pine tree forests so they could get masts, so shipbuilding was important, and perhaps above all, fishing. They were the closest area to the Grand Banks off of Newfoundland, which was filled in those days with cod. People came from Europe in their ships just to fish at the Grand Banks and then take their catch back to Europe. It was so rich, those grounds. And today, as you may know, there's a shortage of cod. Yes?
There was a place called Lunenburg?
Called Blumenberg?
Lunenburg, in Nova Scotia, which had the cod.
Oh,
That was like the richest place in the whole.
yeah, oh, absolutely. No, it was, and so I think that it probably equals, certainly in the early years, in their economy, but then shipbuilding and trade. It was a pretty evenly divided economy, agrarian too, and so it was a fairly successful economy. Okay, so that's New England. Now let's do what the books do and skip to the south. So you have Virginia, the first colony, and then Maryland is settled shortly thereafter, the Chesapeake colonies first. The Carolinas come a little later and are divided into North and South, and then it's not until the 18th century that Georgia becomes the 13th colony. Okay, so the South. What pops into your head when we say the South? Not cotton yet, tobacco first. Cotton will only, well, there is cotton. The Sea Island cotton is very difficult to cultivate. There's a little bit of that, but the main thing is tobacco in the beginning. But agriculture, yes, it's an agrarian economy. What else?
Rice.
Rice in South Carolina, that's true. Boy, you guys are good.
Indigo.
What else?
Indigo.
That's also South. I can see you've been reading about those sisters in South Carolina who raised indigo. Very good. This is a very smart group. Okay, what else though? What helped that agrarian economy succeed? Slavery, right? Absolutely. That would maybe have been because we've been hearing about the 1619 project. Do you know about that? The New York Times. The first 20 blacks who arrived in Virginia in 1619 was the beginning, I guess that's correct, of slavery, though they may not have all been slaves initially. It took a while before that system was established, but they were the first Africans to arrive in a group at that point. So we hear a lot about that now because there's quite an interesting discussion and debate over the New York Times 1619 project. Okay, so you've done well, and the economy is agrarian mainly. You don't have cities in the South. Only Charleston becomes a city in the 18th century because it was the main entry for slaves into the entire region. Maybe 2/3 of all the slaves that entered into the colonies came through Charleston. But that was the only city in the South, whereas you had a number of cities in the North, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, etc. Okay, so very, very good. Now, let's look at the middle colonies. I've said what they are: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, really the main ones throughout the colonial period. What pops into your head? I'm so glad. Nothing. It's really hard. Because there is no single word that you could use like Puritan or slavery or agrarian South that encompasses the character of the middle colonies. They were much too diverse. That might be the single unifying theme, if any, but that's a different kind of a theme. So you're absolutely right. The middle colonies also had a very well balanced economy because of the large and very safe harbor in New York. Trade and commerce was from the very beginning of the colony. And then there also was some very fine soil up the Hudson River. And so agriculture became an extremely important area. In fact, New York came to supply most of the Caribbean islands with their vegetables and fruits because they were only growing sugar there. All right, so, good. me see if there's, what about religion in the South? I forgot to, what about the religion in the southern colonies?
Maryland was Catholic early on.
Maryland was Catholic to begin with, but that lasted only through the 17th century. And that was because the king was very happy to get rid of some Catholics from England at the time. And a wealthy Catholic family was given that as a proprietary colony. That's true. Then, by the 18th century, it was the Church of England that was established in Maryland. What about Virginia?
Episcopalian elites and Baptist dissidents.
Probably the most secure establishment of the Church of England was in Virginia, and then Maryland somewhat. But it was definitely an Anglican colony with, again, an established church where you paid to hire the minister to build the churches, and it was the single official church of the South. But what about in the middle colonies?
The Dutch Reformed Church.
It was initially, right, because of course we know New York was Dutch for 40 years before the English took over in 1664, and the Dutch Reformed Church was established. Although, just like the Dutch in Europe, the Dutch in New Netherlands, as that colony was called before it was New York, allowed people who weren't Dutch Reformed, and there were many of them, to worship, but they had to do so inside a house or inside a barn, inside a building. They couldn't build a church out in the public because the Dutch Reformed Church was established. Then the English took over, and it was simply not possible, and I'll tell you why in a moment, to establish a church in any of the middle colonies. They were simply too diverse. So let's take a little look. I'm going to go through 4 topics in describing New York, which I've listed there. The first one is the ethnic life of the middle colonies, and particularly of New York. I need to find my place here. A deeper look into the characteristics that we're going to look at. And the first one, then, is ethnic pluralism. In the Dutch years, only about 50% of the people in New Netherlands were of Dutch descent, because this was the Dutch Golden Age. They were doing extremely well all over the world. Sort of the first empire, really, was the Dutch Empire, and not many people wanted to leave the Netherlands. So they had fortunately found that people after the Reformation, the wars, the mass migrations that the Reformation, Protestant Reformation caused, because you had to follow the lead of your duke or your prince in terms of whatever religion he chose, whether Catholic or Protestant. People came to the Netherlands because they could do the same thing there. That's where the tradition came from. You only could build the Dutch Reformed Church out on the public streets and canals, but we had these house churches inside the houses, which you can visit today in Amsterdam if you've ever been there. It's very worth doing. They're big houses and big churches, but they're all enclosed, not public churches. So the Dutch were only 50%, however, of the people approximately in their colony, and there were other people, Walloons, Flemish from the lowlands, Germans, people came. The German states were in chaos at various times, so they too came over. The English, there were a few from New England who came down and settled in Brooklyn because they were not happy with the Puritans. Scandinavians, many Scandinavians in New Netherlands also. And in 1643, the colony hadn't even been there 20 years quite yet. There was a visitor who said he heard 18 European languages spoken in New Amsterdam, which was what New York City was called before. Yes?
There were also Jews at the very beginning.
You know, you're going to have to speak up.
There were also Jews at the very beginning.
Yes, and I'm going to get to that. Exactly, there were. Well, not from the very beginning, but very shortly, during the Dutch period, certainly. So let's go to the next slide. And you will see one of my favorite slides, which is in one of my books. This is actually a little bit later. This is a wood block, so it's the imagination of the artist, of course. But you see, well, things are listed here. You could even see what you're looking at on the names. And you have 18 churches, except I take that back right away because it's 17 churches and one Jewish synagogue. Shereth Israel was established in 1654 during the Dutch period when 23 Jews who had been in Brazil had escaped from the Inquisition to Brazil. Now the Inquisition was transferred to Brazil, so they came up and they settled in New York. And they established their synagogue that very first year. Then if this person who told us about 18 languages, European languages, had mentioned the indigenous people who were also still in New Netherland and in New Amsterdam, the Munsee speaking Lenape, the Mohicans of the river Indians, and certainly the Iroquois tribes, which were up Albany and west, the Iroquois Confederation, first 5 nations and then a 6th. They would have had, and also the Africans, because very early in the Dutch period, in fact, just 2 years after the first settlers arrived, there was a boatload of Africans who came, not a large number, small number, but they had come up from Curacao, and they were either slaves or indentured servants, we're not quite sure, because there was confusion about just what the position of these people was, and in fact, many of them got their freedom. I did a study of this. I think 40% of the blacks in New Netherlands received manumission during up to the 1650s at least. So you have slavery in the South, but you also have slavery in the North, as we well know, and particularly in New York. In fact, there was, into the 18th century, around the 1720s, I believe it was, there was finally a way you could actually count the people, a census taken, and we know that about 20% of all the residents of New York City were black. So 1 in 5 was black, and some of these were free. By that time, the slavery system was established. Most of them were slaves. Okay, so back to religion. You have, what are some of these churches? There's the Dutch Reformed, the Lutherans, the Church of England, the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, the Moravians, the Quakers, and they all have their building, and it's a public building on the street. And there was a gentleman who was visiting in New York in 1686, and he said, oh yes, there are all those people. It just was always amazing to Europeans when they came. They couldn't believe this various group of people who all had their churches and were practicing different forms of Protestantism. And he, in 1686, he said, oh yes, there were all those people and those Quakers, but there also were, and this is a quote, singing Quakers, ranting Quakers, Sabbatarians, anti-Sabbatarians, some Anabaptists, some Independents, some Jews, in short, all sorts of opinions. And as I say, this was simply remarkable to anyone who is not accustomed to this sort of thing. Okay, now I've left out mention of a large Catholic, I gave it away. I was going to make you guess. A large Christian group, I meant to say, but clearly you would have known it's the Catholics. Catholics were not welcome in either New Netherland or colonial New York. And there's a reason for that, which I will get to, but it's going to take me a few minutes. But I use this as the best possible segue to my next topic, which is geography. Because you can't talk about history without showing maps and geography and so on, and we can go to the next slide in order to do this. In my opinion, at least, I think it's really crucial. And New York's geography was quite unique and affected the way the colony developed in very definite ways. So this is a reconstruction of a population map. Each of those dots represents 200 people. And it also is dated. It was calculated for 1650. So the colony is only, 30-some years along in its establishment when you have a lot of people, not only in New York, but all of the colonies. The calculation is for 1650. So you see, of course, the people they're making their settlements around the water because it's much easier to get around by boat. Roads, the road was gone, very muddy. So they do settle by the water. You can see that in New England, which apparently does not really even have any inland rivers much. But Connecticut, you see there is some penetration up the Connecticut River. I believe that's what that river is that's shown. Oh, I was going to use I have this wonderful pointer. This is the Connecticut River.
Yeah.
But it only gets up about this far. Well, that's not bad. In the south, the same thing. You have the James River and other rivers going inland, so they go inland a little bit. But it's still, most everybody is around the water. But now look at New York, which is here. This is the Hudson River. And of course, the Hudson River is a broad, navigable river. And so they got up to the Hudson River very fast, and in fact, all the way up to what is Albany here. This is the Mohawk River. And by 1650, there's all those settlements up on both sides, but mainly on the east side of the Hudson River. Now, actually, New York sort of divides down into three different groups, so let's talk about each one briefly. The Hudson Valley, which was settled quickly and therefore penetration into the interior much faster than any place else. And the people who had come in, all these different groups, could go and did go up the river because, of course, one of the things that the Dutch wanted to do was to get furs right away. That was really their economic ambition from the very beginning. And there, of course, they dealt with the Iroquois, who in turn dealt with some of the Indian tribes around the Great Lakes. Once the furs became somewhat exhausted in upper New York, then they had to deal with the Great Lakes Indians who brought them to the Iroquois, who traded them with the Europeans. So it was a very, very profitable trade at that particular time. Furs suddenly became very valuable in Europe. And these people who were, all these different groups who were settled in Manhattan also wanted to own land, which they could buy sometimes legally from the Indians. I always say they got their land by hook or by crook, often by crook from the Indians. That's a whole story in itself, which we could get back to. So we can tell who settled where, who was living in what part of New York, by the names of the towns very often. Kinderhook, for example, that's a Dutch town. It was settled by the Dutch people. Peekskill is another such town because anything ending in kill, K-I-L-L, that's translates as stream in Dutch, means that it was settled by the Dutch. Catskill is another example, and there are several such examples in the Upper Hudson. Yonkers was also a Dutch town. It was spelled with a J, but pronounced like it was a Y, and so it was anglicized from Yonkers to Yonkers. Yonkers with a J to Yonkers with a Y. Spuytenduyvil, if that's the way it's pronounced, and I'm not sure. I have a Dutch friend who says you have to gargle it, so it's probably Spuytenduyvil. But we all know about that on the train stop. But there also was Poughkeepsie. What kind of a name do you think that was? It's Native American, which it shows that they were still there throughout all this period. And it's slightly anglicized. The Kipsy part is an anglicization. If you saw it printed in the Indian letters when they had letters later, you would never know that it could be called Poughkeepsie. Ossining is another. That's a Native American community. Anything that ends in sing means that it is Indian. So you can go through New York and figure out who was where. So the Hudson Valley, we've talked about, that's the first region. The second region is Long Island. And there you would find the Dutch, but certainly were in Brooklyn very early. Brooklyn itself is a Dutch town outside of Amsterdam, and it's a sister city with our Brooklyn. So that's a Dutch origin. Flatbush is another one in Brooklyn. That's a Dutch word. Anything that ends in bush means that it was Dutch. Then you get about a third of the way out on Long Island and you come to Hempstead. Now that's an English word, isn't it? And when you get farther out on Long Island, you have all those Hamptons. West Hampton, Southampton, East Hampton. There must be a Northampton somewhere. And many of the towns out there are English. Why? Because the people from Connecticut were coming over, looking for land, over the Long Island Sound into the eastern two-thirds of Long Island. So it had both these groups, but in very different places. And the economy of Long Island was quite agricultural, also fishing, again, because they were accessible to fishing, and whaling out at the end in a place called Montauk. And what kind of a name is that? That's Indian. So they were still there. Patchogue, that's another Indian name. So you could go around through New York City and you can find who was where when. I just love this idea about it. Okay, whaling. Did I mention whaling? That was also part of Long Island's economy. And then there was Manhattan is the third part, which we've already looked at. And it's the most heterogeneous of all of the parts of New York itself. That mixed population that we've already seen, a pretty well-balanced economy because of this great harbor. Commercial, yes, shipping, trade, mainly. And everyone had their garden plot, but it was not, well, initially there was quite a lot of agriculture still in the Dutch period, but then less as time went on. Okay, now back to my earlier question, why Catholics? I'm going to get to that in a minute, but first I want to say a few other things related to geography, because that's also the Catholics, and unfortunately I don't have a good map for this. So I'll try to illustrate it just with words. The deep harbor, the Hudson River, which you can see on this map, fortunately, but what you can't see is that the Hudson River at Albany can be connected to Lake George, and Lake George is a kind of north-south lake. There's a little land bridge to get to it. Then you get a little bit farther, you go up to the top of Lake George, there's another little land bridge, and you're in Lake Champlain, which is a big north-south lake, and that takes you up to the St. Lawrence River. This is the corridor by which wars were fought. So many things happened along that corridor and were made possible by this passage that I've just described. So New York has a very strong military character. For example, you have the British Navy, we call them Britain by the 18th century. The British Navy for all of the Americas, including the Caribbean, where they had colonies, as well as North America, was headquarters at New York City. So when you look at, and I think we can go to the next slide, because I wanted to capture this for you. You've probably seen drawings of New York City that look a lot like this, and you think, oh, it couldn't have been that crowded in that harbor. Yes, it was, because what you see in the front here are 4 British frigates. These are warships. They were there to protect New York against potential attacks, of which there were some. And then you have all the other shipping that's involved in the background. This is New York City. This little boat in front is probably conveying sailors out to their ships. These are the 4 frigates. This is a city. You see a few church towers here, but if you saw the whole panorama of this very long image, you would see many more towers, which there certainly were. Yes.
Are we looking from Brooklyn or are we looking from Jersey?
Yes, you are looking at from Brooklyn, exactly. You're quite right. This is the, I can't remember the name of the map.
Because the East River at that particular point, it's an estuary, not really a river.
Yes, right. No, the Narrows is between the very southern tip of Brooklyn and Staten Island. That's the narrowest part of the harbor, and sort of where Brooklyn juts out toward Manhattan. And that's very often where these sketches are made. You're absolutely right. So you have the Navy is there, and until the French and Indian War, it's the only place where the Navy is headquarters in the whole of North America and the Caribbean. And you also have a regiment of British Army soldiers who come to New York. Now, I wonder why. There are 2 companies stationed in Albany, 2 companies at the fort in New York City, and it's the only colony that has any British soldiers stationed. And the reason, and I'm getting to the Catholicism now, is that unfortunately we don't have a map to show it, but you know very well that Canada's north of all of this. When you get up to St. Lawrence, you're in Canada, Quebec, and Montreal. And that this is also a very Catholic place. The French were there. This is when the French had made a colony in Quebec, and not as many people as the English had in what will be the United States, but nonetheless quite an aggressive group. France was very imperialistic in its attitudes at that time, and they also had sent over many of the Jesuit Brotherhood had come to this part, had come particularly to Quebec, but also in Montreal, I believe, and they had converted some of the Indians to their side. And the Indians, we believe, it's always been said, were able, that is the Iroquois tribe in particular, was able to put as many men in a field of battle as either the English or the French. So they held the power. They held the balance of power. And that's why the English were very good in working with the Iroquois. The royal governor would go up every year, and he would have these big parleys with the Indians. You've seen pictures of it, sitting around a big campfire, long speeches, gift-giving, back and forth. Wonderful stories about all of that. But this was in order to keep them on the English side rather than on the French side, because the Indians played it very cleverly. They always were saying, well, we think we maybe should go over to the French, but more gifts then would be added. And alas, well, they liked English goods. It's a lot of reasons that the Indian land could be purchased was because they liked English goods, very good wool, cloth, pots, kettles, metal things that they didn't have otherwise. Guns, unfortunately, were also traded with these Iroquois in particular. One of the reasons they were very powerful, and alas, rum, which is another story. But in any case, this is the reason that Catholics were forbidden, and this started with the Dutch period, to come into New York. And there were actual laws. If a Catholic priest was caught in New York, he was to be thrown in jail and ousted from the colony as soon as possible, pretty much all through the colonial period until the French and Indian War, when there were 4 wars in Europe during these years, France and England. That's the whole history of Europe in the 18th century. And those wars had an echo in the colonies The first three, except for one incident that I'll tell you about, were not big wars, but the French and Indian War was a very big war. And of course, that's when the English took over New France, and it became an English colony. But earlier, going back to the end of the 17th century, the French were very aggressive. And have you ever heard of the Schenectady Massacre? 1690, the French and their Indian allies, which were particularly from the Great Lakes area, came down to Schenectady in the middle of winter. It was a snowstorm. They never believed anybody. Nobody fought in the winter in those days, but they did, and they had left, the town had left their gates open. They came in, they killed half the people in the town of Schenectady, took as hostages many others. It was a shudder of horror went through the whole of New York colony at this point. They were all afraid they were also going to be attacked. And this was the reason there was this very strong anti-Catholic feeling from that point on. Okay, so all of these elements that we've been talking about, the ethnic mix, the racial mix, the religious pluralism that we saw, the geography of New York, all contributed to my favorite topic, which is the politics of New York. So let's turn to that subject, which, above all, in my opinion, actually is what foreshadowed what the country would become. It's politics in particular. Because New York politics was quite unique. It was fractured, it was combative, it was volatile. You had all these different little groups, and they often didn't agree with each other, so you had interests that formed, and they would be fighting each other, and it was a very, very vigorous kind of politics that you have in New York. And why particularly was it so unique? Because New York, unlike any of the other colonies, had no representative assembly until 67 years after the colony was established. In Massachusetts, it was 2 years, and they had their General Assembly. This is in imitation of the House of Parliament, the House of Commons in particular in England. People were proud to have the rights of Englishmen. That's something you bragged about in those days because they were much greater. Those kinds of things weren't happening on the continent itself, that you had a voice in your own government. That had started with Magna Carta and all through the earlier English history. So this was also to be the case in the colonies. Each colony was to have a representative assembly. It's usually called the General Assembly, which would be elected by the entire colony, the eligible electors. Am I right that today the New York Assembly is still called the General Assembly? Does anybody happen to know? Just the New York Assembly. Okay. Because sometimes,
Lower house is the assembly.
pardon me?
Just the lower house is the assembly.
Yes, just the lower house, right. And there was only one house. You didn't have anything equivalent to a Senate in those days. The only elective colony-wide organization was the Assembly. But New York finally got its Assembly at the end of, I think it was 1691, the end of the 17th century. But you have to realize that all those years before, you had to be governed somehow. So each of these little villages and towns that we've seen established up the river, out on Long Island, they all had their local boards, which were elected by the electors of that time. They were called mainly, I believe I'm right about this, the boards of trustees. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? That's where the name comes from. If the towns were settled by English, they might have been called boards of selectmen, which was certainly in New England. But I'm not sure that transferred to New York, but it may have. In any case, each of these towns had its own government. The boards were elected by the residents who were eligible. Now, help me out. who could vote. Let's look at the 18th century. Okay, one at a time. I heard men. That's true. Women didn't vote until, can you believe it? Women didn't get the vote till 100 years ago in 1920, but it's true. All right, and how old did you have to be to vote? 21. That's where that comes from, probably from England as well. Okay, right, and somebody said white. Certainly, you're right that the 99 to 9/10% of the people who voted were probably white. I have wondered recently, because I do not believe that white was written into the laws at that point, if a free black who had lived a long time in a neighborhood, was popular there, had worked for the town, might have been allowed to vote, and I'm looking for it in the records. I've never seen it, but I have a feeling it might be lurking there somewhere, so I'm going to, but it would have been unusual, certainly. It was mainly adult, white, probably, male, and there's one other requirement. Property, right. You had to, if you were in a rural area, not in a city, where you wouldn't have had a chance to have a large piece of property, you had to have property worth 40 pounds if you were to sell it, or 40 shillings if you were to lease it. That's right from England. That's common law, had that requirement in its law as well. And you would think, well, that's probably quite a bit of money and maybe not very many people had it. Not true. There have been studies in the last few decades, once we got computers and could run a lot of numbers through them, we've learned that 50% or more of the eligible males were eligible to vote in these elections. Doesn't mean they always did, but that eligibility was that high. How many people in England itself, for example, do you think were similarly eligible to vote? Yeah, 5 to 15%. And remember, at the end, we're going to think ahead to the revolution and so on. And that's a very significant figure, because we're seeing these American men, at least, and their wives, maybe they didn't vote, but they certainly advised their husbands about politics a lot, had ideas about these things. They are actively, either in their local communities or in the General Assembly later on, holding their little bit of power and being represented by people who they chose to represent them. And that's going to be very significant later, so keep that in mind. And the reason is simply because land was more available here. It's a huge space, and of course there are indigenous people, there are European settlers, but there's enough so that you could maybe come over with not much money, lease a farm for a while, save your money, and this happened all the time, and then buy your own property. So it wasn't a planned democratization of this society. That wasn't the idea at all. The English didn't even realize this was happening until too late. But 50% or more of these people were eligible to participate in their government. The only central government was in New York City, and that was the royal governor appointed by the crown in Parliament, by the 18th century, of course. And he was often a military man. Some of them were good governors, some of them less able to handle things. We're going to take a look at that in a moment. Let me just see where I am here. I know. So you had these local governments, and when the General Assembly was established, and now you have this government which is in New York City, the royal governor, and he could appoint a council, not elect, only appoint some advisors to help him govern. The people had for 67 years, or however long you had been there, up until the 18th century, they had been only thinking of their local communities. So when this new government, this stronger central government is established in New York, they are not always very happy to do what the assembly wants them to do, much less what the royal governor. As I say, some of these governors were good politicians, others didn't understand the colonies very well, so there would be problems. So, let's look a little more closely at one particular very interesting period in New York politics, and that we're going to leap ahead to the 1730s. And this is a wonderful picture of it's called the Coffee House Mob. And you can see that they're arguing over politics probably. They're reading the newspapers. There's one fellow here who is tossing coffee in the face of another. You can see this is a splash. The only woman is the one, of course, serving behind the bar there. And coffee house, this is actually an English coffee house because we don't have a picture, an image of a colonial one, but they definitely existed in New York. And they were very popular. The gentlemen and the men would always go there. They would debate politics, and just as they do, I guess, today at Starbucks, but this was way long ago. All right, so we are going to leap ahead to 1733. There was a huge debate between a local official, a colonial in New York, and the new governor, who was Governor Cosby was his name, who unfortunately was totally bereft of political skills. He was just doing what he came with instructions. All the governors had instructions of what they were supposed to, the policies they were to initiate in the colony. But some of them knew how to do it and some of them didn't. And Governor Cosby seemed quite awkward politically. So shortly after he arrived, he entered into a big dispute with a very popular local man named Lewis Morris. And Lewis Morris was the Chief Justice of the New York Supreme Court. The courts had been established throughout the colonies. And they had a falling out. It doesn't matter what it was. It was a very small thing, but it exploded into something very large. And Cosby dismissed Morris from the Supreme Court. He tossed him out. Now, this was certainly a topic that was discussed in these coffee houses. Oops, sorry. I flashed back at, let me see if I can, there I go. No, here we are. Everybody was talking about this in New York, you can be sure. Morris was not happy with this at all. And he, as opposed to Cosby, was a very shrewd politician and a very pugnacious one as well. And he was not going to just let this go. So what he did was he gathered a group of friends also with grievances against this new and rather awkward governor that they had. And he decided that they decided as a group that they would establish a newspaper that would be clearly established to oppose the governor. There was only one newspaper in New York at that time, the Gazette, and it just was for announcements for the government and so on. This is the 1730s. So they established the New York Weekly Journal, is the name that they gave to their newspaper, and its whole intention was to oppose the governor. And this was unheard of. You did not do that kind of thing in these days. You were supposed to be obedient to your government, keep life going along smoothly, not certainly form any kind of organized opposition. That was simply anathema at that time. Did not have any standing in general public understanding. You could petition. If you had a grievance, you could petition, you could gather names. That was the only way you were supposed to oppose government. But Lewis Morris and his group established the New York Weekly Journal in 1733. And for their printer, they needed somebody to print it for them. And the name may have a familiar ring. They hired John Peter Zenger, Z-E-N-G-E-R. He was a German immigrant. His family had come over when he was 13, and he started out as a printer, as a apprentice to the fellow who ran the Gazette. That's how he learned his trade. And why exactly he accepted this rather dangerous agreement, he agreed to become the printer of this paper, we don't know, but he certainly had some idea that he might get him in trouble, which it did. So they established their newspaper. None of the articles were written by Zenger. He was only the printer of the paper. All of the articles opposing the governor were written by Morris and his friends. And Morris had practiced doing this for an earlier governor, who I happen to know pretty well, Lord Cornbury, and other governors. There had been opposition in the past, certainly many times, and he was a very good propagandist, Morris, and the other writers too. They were educated, very smart guys. So they are writing out these articles, and Morris made no bones about what he was doing, because in the very first issue of the newspaper, it was stated that the journal was established to apply, I quote, the lash of satire to wicked ministers. Meanwhile, they're churning out articles, and their goal of these fellows, the Morrisites we'll call them, or the Morris group, was to get Governor Governor Cosby recalled. They wanted him to be sent back to England and get a new governor who they probably would pester after a couple of years also, but nonetheless, they really wanted to get rid of Cosby. He was doing all kinds of bad things, which they related over and over again in this newspaper. All right, the upshot of all this was that of this really fraught political episode, which went on for a couple of years before this happened, is that Zenger was arrested for seditious libel, and he was tossed in jail for 10 months. Now, that's a very serious charge, and of course, it's not the people who are writing the articles who are the ones to be arrested, it's the printer. That was the English common law at the time. Whoever printed the paper was the one who was accused of seditious libel. So the trial took place on August 4th, 1735, and the one thing that the Morrisites had done for Zenger after 10 months in jail is they hired a wonderful lawyer from Philadelphia to come up and to argue his case before a jury of 12 men. Many of them, there was a baker, a brewer, a carpenter, a couple of people of higher rank on that jury. But it was a fairly ordinary, typical jury chosen from the people, the electors. They all had to be electors. And in the jury trial, this lawyer from Philadelphia argued not the typical argument, which would have been about Zenger, but rather he argued the truth of the charges of what was written in the paper. That was not allowed in the English common law of that time, but he just overrode the English common law, and he said all these things are true they said about Cosby, and Zenger should not be held guilty or for seditious libel because of that. The jury adjourned to the jury room, whatever that might have been at the time, probably some little cubby hole. They discussed very briefly the case, and they came back with the verdict, not guilty. So this was a victory. Some people have said that's the beginning of freedom of the press. No, it's not till 1805 that truth becomes, in common law, a defense against libel. So it's much later that happens, but nonetheless, it must have been happening in New York to some degree, even after the Zenger case and before 1805, because once it happens, it's hard to put that back in the bottle. Okay. So a major consequence of this episode, we call it the Zenger-Morris episode, is that New Yorkers developed a new way of thinking about opposition, quite unique, only New York was ahead of the game regarding this, and I'm going to give you some quotations to see how the language changes, because they had formed a party. The word party was hardly even used. That was a dirty word in those days. A faction, they would have been called in a derogatory fashion. Or an interest is probably what it would have been called by themselves. But not the Lewis Morris group. They were happy to attack the governor, and that was their entire purpose. But the wider public view of politics and what could be imagined about opposing power is where you see the language change. For example, before the Zenger case, party was seen, and this is a quotation, as a symptom of disease in the body politic. That was the typical general view. Now, afterwards, or during, and mainly in Zenger's newspaper, of course, you hear, some opposition is not only necessary, but of service to the public. Or, another quotation, parties are a check upon one another and serve to maintain the public liberty. There's even one quotation from this same period that talks about a check and balance, and you know where that's going to lead us eventually. Now, to be sure, unjust criticism, they would retreat then. Unjust criticism was wrong because that might damage the common good. The common good was also a very high value at that time. But, quote, just clamor is the right of all free men to make, we find printed at the time. These are all quotations from the 1730s, the Zenger period, and it's the first time that positive properties are being attributed to factions, and it's happening in New York. They trail away in quieter times, to be sure, but the words have been spoken. They're there now to use again when things heat up, and of course they do. In 1749, for example, you can see that this is now taking it a step higher. Parties were now, quote, so many spies upon one another, and protected the public against the encroachments of power and tyranny. A new word now has entered the vocabulary. So New Yorkers were political innovators. Earlier than any of the other colonies, they reached beyond the wall of traditional understanding about political language and thought to something, and I quote, altogether new. Those are the words of the great Harvard historian Bernard Bailyn, who I knew, and he studied this very topic. He looked at all the colonies, and he wrote a little book about it, and clearly he says New York had reached terrain that was altogether new. Okay, so that is a very important aspect, I think, of the politics of the 1730s, and of course it continued on later. All right, last bit of evidence, and then we'll get to some final closing comments. At the same time, in the 1730s, there was also a very interesting election that was held. 1733, it's a county-wide election. There are two candidates. There's Governor Cosby's candidate. His name is Forrester. He's the county clerk. And then there is none other than Lewis Morris, a delegate to the General Assembly, the General Assembly, they called it then, had died, and so they had to replace him in this election. And this election was nowhere else than Westchester County. It was a county-wide election, so everybody in Westchester's a pretty big county, even bigger then because it included part of the Bronx. And you have these two candidates facing off each other in a party opposition. That's all you could call it, and everybody knew it at the time. Lewis Morris against Governor Cosby. The fullest description, we know so much about this particular election because the first issue of the weekly journal, Zenger's paper, describes this election. It happened right around the same time. And it's the best description of any election anywhere in the colonies. And it's absolutely detailed and a wonderful contribution that the Zenger paper made. This election was held on the Eastchester Town Green. And some of you I know have been there, but others of you may know. It's St. Paul's Church. Have you been to St. Paul's Church in Mount Vernon, any of you? It's now a National Park Service place, and they have programs, a lot of very interesting programs. Connie just received a very nice honor there 1 week ago, I guess it was, where they awarded her a certificate because of her wonderful work toward the Revolution 250th anniversary coming up. So this is where it was held. And I'm going to read to you partly from paraphrasing from my book, but also I want to give you some words from Zenger's paper about this election. It's sort of on the eastern side of the county. Morris's group began to assemble the night before the election, riding in from the outlying areas, mainly in the eastern part of the county, as I say. By midnight, one group had reached New Rochelle, where, quote, a large fire was made in the street by which they sat till daylight. So they put up their campfire. They're going to sit in their chairs and fall asleep or on the ground, whatever. There's surely plenty of liquor involved because all these campaigns, the candidates were supposed to spread liquor everywhere, and they did. And it wasn't considered a bribe. It was just part of the custom. So in the morning, this first contingent was met by about 70 horse of the electors from the lower part of the county, and these all seemed to be mainly people for Morris. And when they all converged on the Eastchester Green, they numbered, quote, above 300 horse of the principal freeholders, a greater number than had ever appeared for one man since the settlement of the county. And then, led by, quote, 2 trumpeters and 3 violins, they rode 3 times around the green. At about 11 o'clock, Forrester's contingent arrived in the morning, and at the head of that band was the Honorable James Delancey, Esquire, Chief Justice of the province of the Supreme Court of New York. He had replaced Morris in that job, and of course he was the governor's man. And along with him was the Honorable Frederick Phillips, also a member of the court. Now, as Irvington and Tarrytown people know quite well, we are sitting on Frederick Phillips's land right now. It included all of Irvington. It ran from, let's say Spuyten Duyvil, Yonkers somewhere, all the way up to Sleepy Hollow, 54,000 acres, the most successful large land holding in New York, all on the river, lots of access to the water. So these are the 2 people, Delancey and Phillips, who had the governor's contingent. And they arrive, and now they were attended by about, and I quote, 170 horse of the freeholders and friends of Forrester, who's the candidate for Cosby. After they arrived, the people, I've envisioned these groups riding in opposite circles around the green. I'm not sure that, they don't say that in Zenger's paper, but what they do say is that when the 2 groups passed, Phillips very civilly saluted Morris by taking off his hat, which the late judge returned in the same manner. So after there's no secret ballot in these days. It's a viva voce vote. So the 2 groups stood probably separately, and the sheriff who ran this election called out, who's for Lewis Morris? And they would all say huzzah or yay or whatever. And the same thing for Forrester, the governor's candidate. It was clear, however, that Morris's group was winning. And so the governor's group called for a poll. Now, that changed everything around because now they have to get a table and chairs, and each elector is going to have to come up and swear that he has enough property and that he lives in the county and so on. This is actually a Williamsburg image in Colonial Williamsburg, but I think they read this description because this is exactly what happens. They have to get a table, chairs, and this is described by Zenger, and pen and paper, and they're going to write down the names of the voters. So now, they start, the election starts at 11 o'clock in the morning. All day long, people come up, the men who are going to vote, and they say, I swear that I have this much property and that I live in Westchester for so many years, whatever. And that takes a lot of time. This is viva voce voting, though. They go up to the table, they make that claim, and then they say who they're voting for. There's no secret. Everybody knows who's voting for who. That is definitely a settled thing. And it went on until 11 o'clock at night. All day long, all evening, and everybody enjoying themselves, sort of a party. And at the end, if I can find where I put this, well, I may be able to remember the numbers actually. Let's see if I don't have it here. The vote was, wait, here it is. This is the final statement in Zenger's paper about this election. The poll continued until about 11 o'clock at night, that's a quotation, at which time the count stood 231 for Morris without the, oh, I forgot to tell you. As the vote was going on, the governor's people realized that they were losing as this vote like this. And so the sheriff, who is appointed by the governor, he threw out 38 Quaker votes. Just tossed them out. And he could do this legally. Do you know why? Why would Quakers vote? They would not swear. That was blasphemy to Quakers. They would affirm, but they would not swear. And of course, the sheriff said, oh, you've got to swear. And so 38 votes were thrown out. But despite that, the count was 231 for Morris, without the 38 Quaker votes, and 151 for Forrester. Obviously, some people got tired and went home, but nonetheless, it's very clear that Morris was the winner. And so the final paragraph on this election in Zenger's paper is, the indentures being sealed, the whole body of electors waited on their new representative to his lodgings, with trumpets sounding and violins playing. Thus ended the Westchester election to the general satisfaction. By that time, so many people had been drinking all day that I think they were satisfied that it was finally over. Okay. Now, I want to just skip to one last thing that's way into the national period. I said I was connecting all of these happenings to what the nation becomes. So let's skip ahead to the ending. Here, my last image. Oh no, this one, I'm sorry, I have to talk about that one first. This will only take a moment. New Yorkers knew how to cooperate when they had to. They could overcome their differences. They had shown that. They were pretty sophisticated politically. And now we're into 1817, even though this map is of the Treaty of Paris, which was the map of what the land was at the end of the American Revolution. You can see that the territory now goes all the way to the Mississippi River over here. It was just this to begin with, so now they've more than doubled the territory. This map is very useful in that regard, even though we're now into a later period. And what was happening is that right after the American Revolution was over, and even before to some degree, people from these 13 colonies, which were now getting pretty crowded, were going over the Appalachian, over the Adirondacks Mountains, into the Ohio Valley, which is in here. And just below the Great Lakes, and they had been there now for 30 years or so, or more, by 1817. And they're producing very rich soil, producing good products, and ready to send their products, and they were sending their products. The easiest way to get them to the water was, initially anyway, down the Ohio River to the Mississippi River, down to New Orleans, into the Caribbean and the Atlantic, and out to the world. Now that's not good for New York. It would have been shorter if they had been able to bring them right into New York, wouldn't it? Wouldn't have had to go all that way. And New York realized that, so in 1817 they began to look into building a canal that would connect them to the Great Lakes, which would open up this whole Western territory, and they would get some of this trade. And they got together, they overcame all the differences in New York. They knew they were going to have to tax the people very heavily in order to do this. So 363, I think I have the figure right, miles that the Erie Canal was in order to connect Buffalo, what became, of course, a big city because of the canal, up here in Lake Erie, over to, doesn't show particularly in detail here, to Albany area, then down into the Hudson River, down to New York, and into the Atlantic. And clearly that was what they felt they had to do, and they did achieve it. Pennsylvania wanted to do this too, but they had two lobbies. They had a canal lobby, and they had a railroad lobby, because railroads were coming into being now. They could not get together. They absolutely couldn't overcome their differences, so New York beat them to it. And what happened was DeWitt Clinton, who was the governor of New York, and now it's 1825, went up to Lake Erie at Buffalo, and he was handed a keg of Lake Erie water, which he carried down the canal, people cheering on every side, into Albany, down the Hudson, and when he got to New York City, he poured it into the Atlantic Ocean. And we have an image of that. It's called the Marriage of the Waters. And it was obviously symbolic of how he had joined, how New York had joined these two, and it made all the difference in the world. It is why New York is today the great city that it is. It rapidly overcame Philadelphia, and after the canal opened, even more so, and why New York is both the commercial and the financial center of the United States, and in a sense of the world. It got started a lot with this and with other things New Yorkers could achieve. Okay, final two very quick points. I said I would connect all of this up to the nation, which we've done somewhat, but also let me just comment on two ways that what you've seen and what I've tried to explain to you about New York and its character and its politics in particular affected first the Revolution and then the U.S. Constitution. For the Revolution, you've heard the phrase, no taxation without representation. That was probably the most repeated slogan the time of the American Revolution as Britain was taxing us. And sometimes people think, oh, well, they didn't want to pay taxes. That's not at all what that was about. It was about representation. And I think you can see why. They were accustomed to taxing themselves. Americans, colonists, had to tax themselves all through the colonial period, but in their own assemblies. And now Britain was going to tax them. They weren't represented in the parliament. So anyway, this is a really critical, I believe, issue, and I've come to think that the revolution was truly inevitable as a consequence of that. If the English had only done what they did when Canada wanted to break free, because they wanted to tax themselves, they created the Commonwealth. That's the point at which it happened. If they'd done that with us, we might all be speaking with English accents today. Okay, so that's one thing with the revolution. The other is that it's okay to oppose power. And that's why I wanted to explain in probably more detail than I should have about the Zenger case, because this really was a critical time when opposition became more regularized. And of course, you needed to have a language of opposition when you got to the revolution. You had to be a reasonable person, and there were people you could quote now who had said these things. As for the Constitution, the three parts of government. Usually governments were divided only between, in England, is our best example, between executive and legislature. Two parts. The Americans added in their Constitution a third part, made the judiciary a third part, because they wanted to have all those checks and balances. And we know that if the president proposes a Supreme Court justice, the Congress has to approve it. And so that's a check on the executive, and it's also a check on the Congress, because the president's the one who proposes the person. And there are many other checks and balances in our Constitution. And the other thing that is definitely, I believe, and New York was definitely the lead on this, the last point I'll make, is the separation of church and state. There was no way when the Constitution was written, and no one proposed establishing a church. You just couldn't do it. It was much too pluralistic a society, and they all point to the middle colonies and to New York in particular. See how they did? Religion was well observed, and yet they had no established church. So I think that New York really should take a better place in these textbooks that we were talking about, and I keep trying to persuade people to do that. We'll see what happens in the future. So I'm finished, but we have time for questions. Yes.
Do you believe that New York's diversity helped foster the kind of innovation that produced the Erie Canal and the commerce and advancement beyond the states that were more homogeneous?
I do, because if you have only one, if you're very homogeneous, as New England was, for example, most of the people throughout colonial New England were English. You didn't have these different groups that were sort of had some different ideas about things. And you don't really learn how to compromise. You don't have to compromise if you're just a very homogeneous group. And even the South was more English, especially in the 17th century, than anywhere else. And so they too didn't have this experience of fighting. I mean, we all say, oh, parties, they're tough. Let's get rid of parties. No, we can't get rid of parties. We need to have this opposition, this debate, because that's how hard as it is maybe to believe today at times, that's how we do actually advance our country. So I do believe, yes, very much, that you had to have a diversified society, and certainly New York and the middle colonies, to somewhat lesser degree, but New York above all had that, and this is why their politics was more advanced. I do think so. Yes.
I have with me here your book, Fractious People, which I think I was using it in grad school soon after you published it in 1971, which you must have published as an undergrad.
No, oh, thank you, but no, I had just gotten my PhD the year before, actually.
My bad. I've been working for several years on a project on the background to the Revolutionary era, and at this point I think I'm prepared to argue that 1763 was a critical year in the movement towards revolution and milestone, because two events that year that probably most of the people here are probably aware of. Number one, the 1763 Treaty of Paris, which gave His Majesty's government all of the territory from the Eastern Mountain Divide, Eastern Continental Divide to the Mississippi, and from the Gulf of Mexico up to the Arctic Circle. 2 million square miles. The proclamation of 1763 gave war veterans up to 7 years of totally botched that up. For example, if they would have been able to monetize the 2 million square miles of territory, like they monetized the debt 70 years earlier in creating the Bank of England, they wouldn't have had a cash crunch, worry about we're going to tax the Americans a couple of pennies to buy some stamps, and by putting border soldiers on the frontier, they would have provided for the cost of maintaining the garrisons along the frontier by means of colonies like the Romans had in Britain, Cologne, Germany, and others. Have you found much evidence that the British ministers, A, look towards monetizing that asset, and B, whether anybody here or back in London made any strong positive efforts to recruit soldiers to settle on the lands in New York Colony?
I do know that Hessian soldiers often were given land, and this is during the Revolution, obviously, and did stay, just remained as citizens of the United States. Otherwise, in terms of veterans, what they did for veterans then, I'm not really familiar with that. I do know, however, you mentioned that the British were giving all these huge land grants, included a lot of land. The British were very grandiose in their charters sometimes. For example, I believe it's there are a couple colonies, but I believe it's Connecticut that was given a charter for the eastern part that ran all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And several of the colonial charters did. So people say, oh, well, they always knew that they were finally going to go to the Pacific Ocean. No, they didn't initially. They were very glad to get to the Mississippi. But I'm just not very familiar with what the laws were or what the grants were to veterans, except for the Hessians I do know about. Okay, anybody else?
Read off your email address, can't quite see it back here. Your email address?
My email address. Oh, well, I'll give it to you. Yeah, it's patbon, PATBON, 1923 @gmail.com. I'll give it to you if you want to have it. And I did bring some copies of my books. I don't have a new book, but I do have first editions of my older, there are 3 different books over there, and I'm giving them away. So whatever, if somebody would just lay those out on the table, and a couple of them are A Factious People, which is about New York Colony. The second one is about religion throughout the colonial world. And the third one is about Lord Cornbury. And I'm not going to tell you what he did, or I think didn't do, but if you want to know, you can look at that third book.